Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. Today I'm going to be creating a French Fairytale piece of wall art. For my project today, I'm going to be using this AB Studios MDF wood blank. This is the label here. This is an older one, but you can still get similar designs online. Now, this is one that I had in my stash because it had quite a bit of damage on some of the corners. So I'm just going to use my craft knife to cut off some of those bits that were already a bit loose. And whatever I do on the left-hand side, I am going to do on the right-hand side so that I can have a balanced design. Once I finished trimming off the issues on the top section, I also trimmed off a little bit on the bottom right-hand section. And again, I'm going to do the same on the left. Once I had that sorted, I took out Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in white. I'm going to be applying 2 coats on the front and back of my MDF pieces. You definitely want to do front and back. Unfortunately, you can get a little bit of warping at times if you don't paint both sides. The primer is going to make sure that my paint adheres really well, and it's also going to block out any possible stains coming through. Once I finished adding it to the base section, I of course then added it to the oval piece that's going to go in the center. Once the primer was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Simply White chalk paint. I'm going to be applying 2 coats on each of my base pieces. When that was dry, I took out Roycycled's Spring Blocks Decoupage paper. This is a piece from that particular design. I really love the castle scene in the center. I'm envisioning that going over the top of the oval piece. So I'm going to position that in the center over the top, and then I'm going to run my craft knife there along the edge, and I'm going to trim that center part out. Once I have those cuts in place, I'm going to remove the oval piece from the center, and I'm going to then go in and start pulling that away. And anywhere that I haven't quite cut enough, I'm going to gently go in and trim that a little bit more. Once I have that organized, I'm going to take out Paint Couture's Decoupage Medium in Matte. I'm going to lay down a generous coat on top of that oval piece. And then I'm going to use my mister to dampen the paper a bit. This is going to help it to be a little bit more flexible. It's going to help it lie a little bit flatter. I'm then going to press it a bit further into the medium, smoothing out any of those wrinkles. You can see I'm using my mister a little bit too. And then once I have that smoothed out, I'm going to go over the top of it with another coat of that decoupage medium to seal it all in. I want to use the other piece from the decoupage paper that I trimmed off, so I'm just working out here how much I'm going to actually be able to use, but I then decided I'd go in with some water on my paintbrush. This is going to help me make some nice tears so that I can separate the words cut postal from the top there. I do want to use that. I'm going to separate the 2 sides, and then I'm going to start working out how I can lay them down so that you can still see that sort of ornate scroll floral detail either side of the oval in the center. I'm then going to lay down some product so that I can decoupage the left-hand side in place. I don't have the oval piece glued down just yet so that I can do this without having to worry about working around that. And then I'm going to do the same for the right-hand side. Once I have that product down, I'm going to smooth the paper down into that medium, and then I did go in with my wet paintbrush, and I'm just going to tear off a little bit more of that paper. I want to add in that cut postal design up the top, so I just want to remove a little bit more of it. I'm just seeing here how the oval piece is going to sit and how much room I'm going to have, and I'm just pulling that paper away just so that it's not super obvious up the top and down the bottom, those extra lines that sort of make that oval shape. I don't really want those to be visible. I think that would sort of interrupt the look of the design. I'm then going to use my wet paintbrush to go around the edge and tear that excess paper away. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't until my decoupage paper was dry that I realized that I had not put these on evenly. The right-hand side was a little bit higher up than the left-hand side, but I knew I was going to be layering in some products anyway, so it was something I was going to be able to disguise pretty easily. When that was dry, I went in and added some more paper down the bottom. Here I'm just working out how much I'm going to be able to fit in. in. Again, that wet paintbrush is definitely a very handy tool to make sort of more organic sort of looking tears. It just sort of softens the transition between the two different sections of decoupage paper. So I'm just tearing off that excess now that I have the piece that I want. Again, I'm always sort of bringing in that oval piece to make sure that it's looking the way that I want, and it was very handy to use that wet paintbrush to trim off the excess from around the outside. I'm then going to be repeating the same process up the top. I'm going to lay down some product, and then I've just got some more of the same decoupage paper, just the scraps from the bits that I didn't use. I'm just going to add that in and again trim that excess paper off from around the outside. I then went over the top of all of the decoupage paper pieces with another coat of that decoupage medium. Next, I'm going to be using some Gorilla Super Glue gel on the back of the oval piece. I'm going to be using this to attach it to the center. Super glue is definitely the best option for that really secure permanent hold. Once the centerpiece was secured, I then took that extra piece of decoupage paper. I'm going to separate the two words there, just again using that wet paintbrush. And then I took the word postal. I'm going to have that down the bottom. I'm going to be creasing around that oval piece so that I know where to trim off that excess. I probably could have done this before gluing the other piece down, but I wasn't exactly sure that I was going to have that or if I was going to use a stamp or something instead. I'm also going to do the same for the top section as well. I'm going to trim off that white piece. That obviously doesn't really go with what we are doing here, so I'm just going to then use my decoupage medium to decoupage each of those pieces down. Once I had the bottom section sorted, I then moved on to the top section. I'm going to lay down some decoupage medium and then add in that extra piece of decoupage paper. I do really love to add a little bit of typography to my projects. Again, if you don't have this decoupage paper, you can definitely substitute in whatever kind of designs or maybe even napkins or stencils to achieve a similar look. So I'm going to go over the top of that with some more decoupage medium. And then I took out Redesign's Madame Garland mold. I've dusted the designs that I want to use with cornstarch. I thought that I was going to be using the section that has the bow as well, but in the end I decided to just use the roses, which you'll see I sort of trim that bow off a little bit later. So I'm just flexing the mold and then I'm going to flip it over and release my casting. The bow can be a little bit tricky, so I just sort of use my fingernails to pop that out. And then you'll see that I start to position the roses. I wanted to frame out the beautiful castle scene there, but as I was laying this down, the bow just didn't feel quite right. I wanted to add in something else, so I decided to separate that piece away. I then continued to cast some more of the Madame Garland designs until I had enough to go around the outside of that center oval. Again, this mold is unavailable at the moment, but it has come back in stock before, so just keep your eye on Redesign's website. Alternatively, any sort of smaller rose design would definitely still work if you want to achieve a similar look. So you can see I'm organizing those roses around the center section, and then I took out Redesign's Angelic Aura mold. I'm going to do a partial casting here. I really like these sort of scroll and leaf details here on the corner of this piece, so I'm just adding my clay there, and then I'm going to flex that, and just like before, flip the mold over and roll it back. I'm going to have these down the bottom. I really liked the shape. I'm going to cast a left and right hand piece to go on each of the sides, so you can see I'm dusting the other one with cornstarch. I really like to work with clay because it's easier to do partial castings, it's easier to mold them to the surface. But if you're not confident using clay, you could use resin for this and just do little dabs of hot glue in the mold to create almost like a dam so that you don't have to cast the whole thing. I ended up casting one more of each of these designs to go up the top. I knew I probably wouldn't be using the whole thing, but I thought I would just cast two of each of these, or one of each of these rather, to go up the top. Here you can see I'm just working out how I might position them. Already I was feeling like maybe it was a little bit crowded. I did pull off some of the greenery to go down the bottom. So I went back to the Angelic Aura mold, and I'm going to cast this beautiful vase with flowers with my air dry clay there, and then I'm going to flex that mold, and I'm envisioning this going up the top of my project. And once I had that there, as I said, it felt a little bit too crowded having all those different pieces there. So you'll see I did then change out the layout, and I sort of broke those larger pieces off. Once I had most of my castings sorted, I then decided that I would start gluing them in place. I'm using Sealy's Quickset wood glue for my project today. If you can't get that one, I know that Type 1 Quick and Thick is meant to be really good for clay castings as well. So I'm going to continue adding glue to the back of each of my castings. I'm gluing them down while they are still wet. I want to be able to bend and manipulate them, and you really should only do this while they are still wet, otherwise you risk breaking them. So I'm going to continue to glue them down. You can see that I do have some of those leftover casting pieces in the bottom section there, but I don't end up using those. You'll see shortly I came up with a different idea for those. It just looked a little bit too crowded there. Once I had all of those pieces glued in place, I went back to the Angelic Aura mold, and I'm going to cast some of the smaller rose designs from that one. I'm going to cast the 2 rose design and then 2 of the same single rose design to go down the bottom, and then I'm going to glue them in place. I let my castings dry overnight, and the next day I came in with Pentart's Crackle Paste Primer. I'm going to be applying this in a few different areas. I wanted it to look almost like old cracked plaster. I'm definitely going for a vintage French fairytale sort of a look, so I thought bringing that texture in would be great. So I'm just applying that in a few random spots, and as I said before, I didn't quite place my decoupage paper down evenly or straight. The right hand side is up a little bit higher, and I wanted a way to disguise this a little bit. I wish it was something I had have noticed before it was completely dry, but that's okay. This is one way that we can disguise that. So if you make an error, keep this in mind, that you could bring in another texture and hide that mistake. Once that was dry, I took out the cracking paste by Pentart, and I'm going to be applying that with my palette knife there. You'll see I have it on sort of an angle, and the reason I'm doing this is that I was able to use the light to see where that cracking paste primer was. Obviously once it's dry it becomes clear, so it can be a little bit tricky to see. So I have it on a bit of an angle there so that the light catches it, and so I can see exactly where I put it. If I got it anywhere that I didn't want it, I did use a wet wipe to pull a little bit of it back. You can do that. And obviously you just want to be a little bit gentle with your decoupage paper. So I'm just going to continue to apply that beautiful Pentart paste over the sections where I have the primer. I just wanted to share with you all that Royce from Roycycled Treasures decoupage paper very kindly gave me an affiliate link. So if you are interested in getting this beautiful spring blocks decoupage paper, check out the links in the description below. I'd really appreciate it if you would use my affiliate link if I inspire you to give it a try. Once I finished applying the cracking paste, I then took out my hairdryer to speed up that drying process, and it was very satisfying to see those beautiful cracks start to appear once I started to apply the heat. When the paste was completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Antiquing Glaze. I'm going to be working in sections and applying it over the top of my clay. Now obviously the clay is unsealed, so I am going to be working in sections so that I can wipe back as much or as little as I want. I'm also adding the glaze over the top of that cracking paste that we have down, and I'm loving the combination of that. I'm wiping the glaze away from the top sections of my castings. Again, this is one of my favorite ways to really bring out the definition in your castings. This is going to create a vintage and worn look, so obviously if this is not to your taste, you could leave this step out. I really love to do it, as I said, to create that definition. So I'm just going to continue to add that glaze over the top of my castings and also over the top of the cracking paste. I'm avoiding the center section though. I do want to keep that section bright, and I don't want to obscure that with any glaze. As I said before, I am applying this over the top of my clay, which is not painted or sealed, so I'm working in sections. You could definitely seal your clay pieces if you're worried about not being able to pull back as much as you want. And if you don't have glaze, you could use a wax for this step. Just pop a clear wax down first. Or another option would be to create a brown paint wash. Once I finished applying the glaze and it was completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Vintage Moss mineral paint there, and I'm just going to be using a small artist brush to apply it to the leaf details up the top first, and then to the leaf details on the Madame Garland castings that we glued around the center. I'm also adding the vintage moss to the leaf scroll style details that we have down the bottom and up the top. When that was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Ballet Slipper Luxe Metallic Paint. I'm just going over the top sections of my castings. I don't want to obscure the glaze that we have sitting in the lower points. And I'm just going over the top of the roses that are in the Madame Garland mold, working my way around. I really love this pink. I'm just trying to think about what colors are in the center paper. And I think pink definitely complements the color tones of that decoupage paper. So I'm just going to continue adding that to the roses around the center, and then I'm also adding it down the bottom. I'm also going to quickly add in some of that vintage moss down the bottom where I'd forgot to put it. I then took out Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic. I'm going to go over the top of that beautiful vase up the top with this lovely metallic. I'm also going over the top of the scroll details. I do love to add in some sort of a metallic. You could definitely use antique gold or maybe even a silver, but I'm just going in over the top of those scroll sort of details. And then I did end up adding some to a makeup sponge, and I'm just going around the border of my blank there with that to create a bronze sort of halo around the project. Once I finished adding it around the outside, I used the same sponge with the bronze to lightly go over some of these scroll details down the bottom and up the top. Next, I took out Paint Couture's Pitch Black Chalk Paint. I diluted some of the paint with my mister, and then I just used my brush to lightly flick the bristles to create some small little speckles. This is definitely a fun technique to create a little bit of age, so I just lightly went over the top of that, and anywhere that maybe I got it a little bit too much, I was able to wipe it back with a wet wipe. I also then went in and got a little bit of paint on my brush. You can see I rubbed a little bit too hard here. A little bit of that text disappeared, so I've just filled that in just a little bit. And then I used the same brush to go around and add the black to the outside edge. I don't want to obscure the bronze, but I did want to bring in a little bit of a darker sort of a halo around the outside, so combining that black with the bronze. When that was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Simply White Chalk Paint again. I'm going to get a little bit on my brush, offload some of it, and then I'm going to go in and do a little bit of dry brushing just over the top of some of the darker lower points. I wanted to lighten it up just a little bit so we could see some of those details a little bit better. So I'm just lightly going over the top. Again, I do not have much paint on my brush. This is very much more like dry brushing. And I did also decide to go in and do a little bit of it over the top of the top section as well, and also on some of the lower points as well to bring in a little bit more light here and there. But you can see I do have a wet wipe, so anywhere that I get it a little bit too much, I'm going back in and I'm pulling some of that back. So again, I just went in very lightly over the top of some of the darker decoupage sections just to lighten them up just a little bit. After this, I did notice that some of the ballet slipper was a little bit hidden, so I went in with a makeup sponge and I'm just lightly going over the top of the roses with a little bit more of that ballet slipper. I know there's a lot of layers to this project, but it really does make a difference to think about all of those layers. Moving on to the back section, I took out Paint Couture's Vera at the Ballet mineral paint. I'm going to end up doing 2 coats of this on the back section. I didn't want to just leave it blank. I did want to add a little something to the back, although I do imagine that the front section will be the part that I will display more often. I just felt like it would feel more finished if I did this. I then took out Paint Couture's Arabian Gold Metallic Stencil Paste and Redesign's Read My Letter Stencil. I believe this one can still be found online, although it is pretty similar to the Ghost Writer stencil that you can get from Redesign. I'm just going over the top of the stencil with the metallic paste using a palette knife to scrape that over the top. So this metallic paste is obviously very pigmented and just a really gorgeous bright gold, but it's also going to be raised, so it's going to just give the project a little something extra special. And obviously you don't have to do this, you could just do a regular stencil if you wanted. I just thought this would be a really nice touch. So I'm just going over the top of the stencil until I have all of those letters covered, and then I'm going to gently pull that stencil back. When that was dry, I grabbed another stencil from my stash. I really just want this beautiful crown to go up the top. It didn't really feel finished, so I thought adding this would definitely be a nice touch up the top. So just like before, I'm adding that stencil paste a little bit at a time, running the palette knife with the paste over the top and really holding that stencil down. And obviously the stencil paste underneath was already dry before I tried to do this. Once I was finished doing this particular design, I also grabbed this other stencil that I will link below. I'm just going to be using the little element down the bottom there. I just felt like having something up the top and down the bottom would make this feel a little bit more finished. Once that was dry, I took out my Van Dyke Brown Antiquing Glaze again, and I'm going to start applying it to the back section. Now, I obviously do want a vintage and worn look, but you could definitely leave this glaze step out. As I was applying the glaze, I was also using my water mister to help move it, and also adding the water like this dilutes it so it's not as thick and dark, and then obviously going in with a wet wipe to spread it. But also you'll notice I'm using a dabbing motion there. This helps to create almost like little water droplets that look like aged spots, so it's definitely one of my favorite things to do. When that was dry, I took out the pitch black chalk paint again, and I'm just going to do something very similar like I did on the front. I'm going to run that brush along the edge to create a darker border. This is just a simple touch, but I definitely think it really can sort of finish off the piece by sort of framing it out. And anywhere that I get too much paint, I am able to wipe that back with a wet wipe. That Vera at the Ballet mineral paint has that built-in sealer. When that was dry, I took out this ribbon that I had in my stash. I'm just going to work out how much I'm going to need, and then I'm going to trim it to size. I did, however, feel that it was a little bit too thick, so I'm going to make a cut down the center to get it started, and then I'm going to tear that in half so that I have a narrower piece to work with. I'm then going to be using my hot glue gun. I'm going to add a dab of glue on the right side and press my ribbon into that. I am using a low temp heat gun, so make sure you're being careful if you're using a heat gun. I'm then going to add the left hand side into the hot glue as well. And then I had these little caps. I think they are from jewelry making. I just found them while I was thrifting, and I'm going to be adding some hot glue over the top of the ribbon and then adding one of each of these over the top. I just feel like it sort of tidies up the look of it a little bit more, having these little caps there. And here's a look at our finished project. I love how this turned out. I definitely think it has a French Fairytale vibe, and that Decoupage paper by Roycycled goes perfectly with the Redesign Moulds. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, comment, and share it out. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of our videos. You can find a full product list and my affiliate links in the description below. Thanks for watching.